the previous videos, we looked at the requirement phase in the plan and document perspective. How a software team can gather and analyze requirements and how they can organize this information in a document known as the SRS or the Software Requirement Specification document. We saw that the SRS document serves as an agreement between the customers and developers. However, in many projects, customers themselves are unsure of the requirements and their understanding of their needs evolve and can change over time. So how can we address this issue? The Agile perspective can address some of these problems. So in week 1, we saw that the Agile process involves working closely and interacting frequently with stakeholders to develop and refine requirements. It also involves building a working prototype and refining it by adding new features in sprints or iterations. And these iterations run typically every 2 weeks. So in the Agile perspective, we are basically in the maintenance mode as soon as we come up with some requirements, and then we start implementing features which match these requirements. So this Agile life cycle begins with what is known as Behavior Driven Design. So let us look at what Behavior Driven Design is. Behavior Driven Design, or BDD, it asks questions about the behavior of an application before as well as during development so that stakeholders are less likely to miscommunicate. So even in this case, requirements are written down, but these requirements are continuously refined to meet the stakeholders' requirements and expectations. The BDD version of requirements are known as user stories. And user stories take the place of what SRS was in the plan and document perspective. Now let's look at what user stories are. So user stories are short, informal, plain language description of what a user wants to do within a software product, which is beneficial and of value for them. So user stories come from the human-computer interaction community or the HCI community. And these user stories are developed in 3" by 5" or 3 by 5 index cards. So we write these user stories in small cards. And user stories are the smallest unit of work which can be done in one sprint. And one sprint is roughly 1 to 2 weeks. And user stories follow a particular pattern or template, which is known as the role, feature, benefit pattern, which states that as a particular type of user, I want a particular action so that that provides a particular value or benefit to the user. So let's look at some examples. So let's take the example from the seller portal problem that we discussed in the previous lectures. Here is a requirement that we gathered from several stakeholders about viewing an inventory. So a user story for this is shown here. The feature is view inventory. So as an independent seller, which is a type of user, I want to view my inventory, which is an action, so that I receive a particular benefit. That is, I can take stock of the products which are low in number. Let's take another example of tracking customer feedback. So what will a user story for this look like? So here again, we follow the same pattern. As an independent seller, which is the type of user, I want to view my customers' feedback for each product, and so that I can get a sense of the pertinent issues in my product. So this is the value which we are providing to the user. So what are some benefits of these user stories? One, we saw that they are lightweight versions of the requirements as opposed to the SRS documentation which we saw earlier. Second, user stories help stakeholders plan and prioritize development. So for example, if I want a feature which has to be implemented first, maybe to get immediate feedback or to get a feel of the system, I can prioritize the development of the user story corresponding to that feature. So for example, we have two features of viewing inventory and tracking customer feedback. In this case, the client might want to implement the catalog and the inventory first. So the development team can tell the customers that we will provide the view inventory feature in 2 weeks. So if you have noticed, we have not told the customers how we will implement these features. So by concentrating on the behavior versus the implementation of the application, it is easier to reduce misunderstanding between stakeholders. Another benefit is that it facilitates conversations between the users and the development team. So more than creating user stories, it is this conversation, this back and forth between the different perspectives of each participant that will bring better, simpler, and more valuable solutions to users' problems. So for example, let's take this feature of tracking customer feedback. So when we show this to a client, the customer or the client will realize that maybe I would also like to be notified by email about the products which have low ratings of 1 or 2 stars. And such modifications are common in the Agile perspective, and user stories can facilitate such modifications. So what are some guidelines to create good user stories? The acronym SMART can help us come up with good user stories. SMART user stories are specific, they are measurable, achievable, relevant, and time-boxed. So let us look at each of these in detail. First, user stories should be specific. So specific user stories are essential so that we know exactly what to implement. So let's consider this user story, which states that users can search for a product in the catalog. So this is a bit vague because we have not exactly specified, for example, what type of product it is, or based on what attribute can we search for a product. A more specific user story can be that the user can search for a product by title in the catalog. Next, user stories should be measurable. So each story should be testable, which implies that there are known expected results for some good inputs. So let's take this feature. The seller portal should have good response time. So what do we mean by good? This is vague and it is not easily measurable. A more measurable user story can be, so when adding a product to the catalog, the product should appear in the catalog within 3 seconds. And this is measurable and this is testable. So make sure that your user stories are measurable. Next, user stories should be achievable. Ideally, we should be able to implement a user story in one agile iteration, that is in 1 to 2 weeks. And if you're not able to complete one story per iteration, then they are too big and you need to subdivide these stories into smaller ones. So for example, view inventory we might not be able to implement this in 1 week or in one iteration. Hence, we can divide it into 2 or 3 features, where feature 1A is we implement the feature of viewing all products in the inventory in a single page. And then we add pagination, and maybe filters can be the next feature. So in this way, we make sure that one user story is completed in one agile iteration. Next, user story should be relevant. So user story must have some business value to one or more stakeholders. So how can we be sure that a user story is relevant? We should ask questions. We should ask questions like, why is this feature needed? Is it really important? Is it adding any value? So what if this feature is added? So these questions can help us and ensure that the user stories which we add are relevant. Next, user story should be time-boxed. So time-boxed means that we should stop implementing a feature once we have exceeded the time budget. So what should we do if we have exceeded the time budget? One is we either give up, or as we saw earlier, we divide the story into smaller ones. Or we reschedule what is left according to a new estimate. We revise our estimates. So it is important to make sure that you are on schedule. So we have seen the benefits of user stories, but let's reflect on this question for a moment on what are certain drawbacks of user stories. Are they always good? Can they not be used in certain situations? Please pause this video and write down your responses before proceeding. So what are certain drawbacks of user stories? One, it may be difficult or too expensive to have continuous contact with customers throughout the development process, because customers may not want to participate or they may not be available at all times. Second, this approach may also not scale to very large software development projects or even safety critical applications, because in such projects, extensive planning and documentation is required before the actual implementation. And especially for safety critical applications, there is no room for errors or refinement. So the key point to remember is that software development methodologies depend on the type of application you are building. So in this lecture, we looked at Behavior Driven Development or BDD. So BDD asks questions about the behavior of an application before and during development, so that the stakeholders are less likely to miscommunicate. We saw that the BDD version of requirements is user stories. We saw the role feature benefit pattern or template. We looked at the characteristics of good user stories, that is smart user stories, that it should be specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time boxed. And we also looked at the benefits and drawbacks of user stories.